I like a good campfire experience. It's something that you don't really get to do too often where we live because it's usually just not cold enough. But think about maybe a campfire experience that you had once, and as you're staring at the fire, and it's a strong, blazing fire, and it's just a really good environment. Oftentimes what ends up happening is there's usually, an ember or two that will eventually just kind of fly into the air and kind of go, a foot or two out away from the fire. And think about what happens to that ember as it goes out to the outskirts of the fire. Maybe it's glowing orange, and then it just kind of dwindles, and then it dies. And I may have used this image before because I really like it. It's a really good image for us about the importance of staying connected to the Christian community. That as we separate ourselves from the community, we, similar to the ember in the fire, we kind of lose our flame. And eventually, the fire that was within us starts to just kind of dwindle a little bit. God used the image of a fire as well whenever he revealed himself to Moses in the Old Testament. You may remember the story. Moses was, an Israelite who, after having killed one of the Egyptians, flees away and is in hiding, and eventually stumbles upon a bush that's on fire. And this burning bush is really interesting because although it's aflame with fire, it's not consuming the bush. And this is the image that God chooses to reveal himself to Moses, the bush that's not consumed by the fire. And then begins the story of Moses that eventually leads to saving the people from Egypt and bringing them into the Promised Land. But in that conversation, God reveals himself as the God who is, and he sends Moses on a mission that Moses does not want to participate in, a mission that seems really impossible, a mission that seems really inconvenient. But nonetheless, Moses, because he's a humble man, obeys the mission that the Lord gives him. And as the story unfolds, Moses and the Lord continue to converse. Moses continues to go back to the Lord and even wrestles with him, not physically wrestles, but he, even struggles in the calling that the Lord has given him. But the Lord continues to give Moses all that he needs for the mission for which he's called. In today's gospel, Jesus says to remain in me as I remain in you. Remain in my love, he says. And he says, if you follow my commandments, you will remain in my love, just as I, Jesus, have followed the commandment of the Father, just as I, Jesus, have remained in the Father's love. And then he tells his apostles, remain in my love and love one another as I have loved you. And it's such a simple but yet easy thing to neglect and let go of. Such a simple but yet important and essential teaching. To remain in Jesus. To remain with him and in him at all times. That no matter what the Lord is putting in front of us or around us, that we are constantly in contact with him. Similar to how Moses was constantly in contact with the Lord throughout his life. But it's obviously easier said than done. And Jesus says, I tell you this so that your joy may be complete, so that my joy may be in you. And you see, I really believe that the hardest thing that any of us will ever do is to love. That might seem like an odd thing to say. But if we understand love to be what it really is, if we remember that God is love, and the way that Jesus loved is that he laid down his life for us, and he calls us friends. This is love. I really believe this is the hardest thing we're ever going to do. The Catechism of the Catholic Church defines charity in paragraph 826. It says that charity is the soul of holiness. That holiness is, I think that sometimes we misunderstand what holiness is all about. Sometimes because of certain people that are in fact holy, but because of their certain experience, sometimes we tend to limit our understanding of holiness. Maybe we think that holiness sometimes is only for people that work full-time for the Catholic Church. Or we start to kind of think about holiness in terms of, those people, maybe your friends, the friends of yours that had a really, really hard Lenten penance. It was super intense and very impressive, and they did it. And you say, wow, they're holy. Or maybe you think about holiness as people that are really successful and fruitful in their life and in their ministry. And obviously God must be with them and God's blessing them, so they must be really holy. Or maybe there's other examples, but sometimes we kind of confuse what holiness is about. But the Catechism, 826, reminds us that holiness, the measure of holiness, is none other than charity. And you see, charity sometimes is just not measurable. Sometimes it goes unrecognized. It goes unappreciated. Charity sometimes is in the ordinary. In fact, usually it's in the ordinary. And I believe that's what makes it so hard, because we don't get celebrated for it. Charity is hard because charity is about loving others for the sake of loving God. Charity is about dying to our own preferences and comforts and conveniences so that someone else may benefit. And it's one thing to do it for someone that you really care about, but what about the person that you don't really care about? What about the person that's a little frustrating or inconvenient? Person that might be in need? That's where true charity comes into place, whenever we die to ourselves for their good. But Jesus says that this is what brings us joy. This is how we experience the joy of the Lord. This is loving others as if they are friends. This is the commandment, to love one another as I have loved you. So I want you to think, who is the person in your life that is most difficult to love? Or maybe a different way to say it is, who in your life is the most difficult to serve? And I'll take it a step further. Who in your life is the most difficult to serve with joy? I'm sure we have at least one person in our life. And you see, that now becomes the litmus test for our love for Jesus. That becomes the measure of our charity. It's one thing to love the people that are easy to love. It's another to love those that are difficult to love, and to do so with joy, to serve them with a pure heart. That's hard. But that's what Jesus is getting at, to remain in my love, to remain in the love of the Holy Trinity, the total, generous, self-giving love for others. That's hard, but that's holiness. And it's in your everyday experience. It's in the ordinary moments that no one else notices. This is how we remain in Jesus. But the good news here is that Jesus desires our joy. Jesus wants us to be filled with divine joy. This is the mark of the true Christian. But too often, because we feel empty or disconnected, and too often because we are inward and self-serving, we don't feel joyful. And instead, we're desperately grasping for happiness in pleasure or success through money or power or honor. And it's just not the same as the divine joy that comes from Jesus. When we remain in God, die to ourselves and serve others, there is a joy that comes alive within us. You might be thinking, okay, this sounds nice in theory, but in practice, it's just not going to happen. And if you feel ill-equipped or a little discouraged there, This goes back to remaining in Jesus. How do we remain in Jesus? Remember that charity is a theological virtue. In other words, the theological virtues of faith, hope, and love, we don't get those by just being really good at it. We get those by receiving. They're a gift to be received, and we have to ask for it. So if you're feeling low on your charity barometer, ask for more. Ask the Lord to give you this grace of charity. It comes from prayer. It comes from the sacraments, especially the Eucharist, which is the sacrament of charity, and from confession, the sacrament of mercy, another word for charity. As we receive God in prayer and worship, now we are ready to serve God by serving others. The measure of our holiness is in the measure of our charity, dying to ourselves so that others may benefit. This might be your spouse, your kids, your parents, co-workers, peers, or random acquaintances in the grocery store. This is especially the poor and the ill and the needy in your life. As we die to ourselves for the sake of others, we experience the joy of the Lord. And isn't that something that we all desire? Today we choose to remain in Jesus by loving others as he has loved us. Amen.